Hey, this is Mark with Anatomy of Tone. In this video, I'm going to discuss the rate to which you should be learning in order to maximize your growth. Um, I think there's this notion, of course, if you just keep supplying large amounts of information to your brain, say with guitar technique or music theory, that you're going to learn faster. But much like when we're practicing the guitar, which any of my students will know, I'm always telling them they're playing everything too fast and encouraging them to play everything at as slow as a speed as possible rather than the fastest as possible because it takes control. Well, a similar philosophy can be applied to when we're actually learning music. There's a limit to how much we could take in at one time. There's a saturation point. And this could vary depending on who you are, right? And the number of factors that can determine this, everything from your lifestyle, your age, your concentration level. But one thing is for sure, although to some degree the rate may subtly change, there is a point where you can be cramming too much information into your brain, and it's not allowing us to encode that information strongly. But how do we apply this? Well, one way to apply it is just to keep a list of the things that you're learning. I like to keep a log of when I'm practicing. I try to set up practice schedules for myself, and I'm a big fan of this practice for 5 minute technique where any skill I'm working on, I practice for 5 minutes and then I move on to the next one. And I try to fill up most of my rehearsal time with that and then leave maybe 15 minutes at the end to jam. So if I have an hour to practice, then 45 minutes is going to be set up for me working through these 5 minute modules, and then the last 15 minutes are going to be for me to just jam and have fun, right? But within those 5 minute modules, I'm blocking out different elements to practice. So some of them are going to be technique, right? If I'm trying to learn a new picking technique or trying to work out a hard phrase or finger a new chord and just work with voicings. And some of it is also learning theory and concepts. That also works into my 5 minute plan. And within this 5 minute plan, obviously, like, I'm listing what I'm learning, so I'm keeping track of what I'm taking in. And it takes 30 to 60 days to develop a habit. Not all habits are bad, right? There are good habits too. Also takes 30 to 60 years, maybe sometimes a little bit longer, days to rewrite a habit. So if you're trying to overwrite a bad habit, it's going to take a little time to be able to replace that old habit with a new habit. Okay, so we want to use this to our advantage. We're going to be planning as we're learning to know how long it's going to take and then when we're going to be replacing information. So I'm not overstacking the information that I'm learning. So I fill up my time for my 45 minutes, and maybe I'm practicing 15 minutes of music theory in there. So let's say I'm learning the notes on the guitar neck. Okay, 5 minutes a day, I'm working on learning the notes on the guitar neck, perhaps one string at a time. And then once I get that done, I'm going to put that on. Maybe now I'm learning how to play triads, right, on the guitar, right, and on one, maybe just on one string at a time too, as an example. And then I'm going to get good at that. I'm going to replace that with another skill. The idea is I'm not trying to do them all at once, right? So I'm narrowing my scope in order to be able to focus a little bit more zoomed in on a topic. So more micro rather than macro. And this is important because if you take in too much information or you put too much on your plate, it's just like with food, right? You sometimes you go to like depending on what kind of food you eat, but like a good example is like a barbecue spot, and sometimes they get you because you order by weight, and they're like, how much do you want? And your eyes are bigger than your stomach, and you end up ordering more food. And it ends up being really expensive because your eyes are bigger than your stomach, and then you go to eat and weren't able to eat it all, right? But you spent a lot of money. So I think a similar thing happens when you're trying to learn music, whether this is technique or whether it's music theory or composition or any aspect of music, is that if you're taking in too much, it's going to be the same thing. You're not going to be able to finish it all and digest it all. And it's really important that the information that you are learning, that you're using on a frequent basis, because what you do is you initially learn a concept, right? And it kind of sits in this temporary part of your brain. But what you want to do is you want it to then to get coded to the deeper part of your brain. So think of it like initially as being in a holding center. And what happens to some people is that they get this false sense of confidence when they learn something, that they feel that they've learned it, but they really haven't deeply learned it. It's still in that holding area. And then when they actually have to go and apply it later, well, one thing may have happened. May have never given it enough time to actually be seeded into the deep memory, right? And that confidence of knowing it now is gone, because when they go to apply it, all of a sudden they don't feel as stable, and all of a sudden they can't do it like they thought they could do it, right? So this is why it's important to obviously spend 30 to 60 days working on any kind of task to really move it from the holding center into the storage center of your brain. Repetition also plays a part in this, but not the type of repetition that I associate with rote memorization. Rote memorization is often a technique where, again, you're learning information really fast just to put in the holding cell so that you can get through a test or something, and then that information is just going to go out the window. You're going to find, like, later in life, you're not even going to remember what you did, or hardly any of it. And that's not very useful, right? And that's one of my issues with a lot of the educational system, is that it really lays heavily on rote memorization, which isn't going to yield useful results in the future. So where repetition comes in is practicing things on a regular basis. And it's not a matter of quantity of time. It has more to do with the quality of time. Now, that doesn't mean that if you play for 2 minutes a day, period, that you're going to become really experienced and competent at your craft. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying you can get away with less time if it's more focused and if it's frequent. So you're better off practicing for an hour and 45 minutes a day and achieving that 5 to 6 days a week than you are practicing 6 hours 2 days a week. Right? That's not as effective. The reason is, each day we're kind of reintroducing that information to our brain again. It's like, oh, you remember me? Oh, you remember me? Right? Imagine you're in a crowd. Say we're in Times Square in New York City around Christmas time. It's very busy in Times Square around Christmas time. People come in from all over to go to musicals and see the tree and shop and stuff, okay? Well, imagine seeing all the people. You're not going to recognize all the people there, right? But imagine if we kept going back to that same place in Times Square, maybe at the Rockefeller tree, and we kept reliving that same memory every day and the same experience. It was a Groundhog Day, and you keep going back and the same exact thing starts happening. So you're in a time loop. You're going to start recognizing people, right? You're going to start to recognize the security guards that are there. You're going to recognize the person who's trying to sell you on taking your picture in front of the tree, right? You're going to recognize the people who are running the kiosks and selling gifts and merchandise, because you're seeing them over and over again. They start to become familiar to you. Well, this is how your brain works, and practicing only maybe 1 or 2 days a week is more the equivalent of coming back to New York once a year. Even if it were the same people living in the same experience of the time loop, it would take a really long time for you to start to recognize a lot of those people on a regular basis, just from the sheer time, 360 days in between that. Whereas if it was a time loop that happens over and over again in a shorter period of time, say every day, you're going to start to recognize all those people a lot quicker and embed it in your brain. Well, this is how it works with music. It's how it works with everything that you're trying to learn, but we're specifically talking about music here. So doing it on a regular basis, even if you're practicing an hour a day and you're breaking things up into 5-minute chunks, then what you're going to notice is that you're going to, like if you were living in that time loop in Times Square, you're going to start recognizing things a lot more. And this is where it's at. A good way to measure that is based on how much practice time you have. So if you only have a half an hour and you're working on technique and theory at the same time, then you're going to have less time to embrace more topics. So you're going to have to thin out how much you're studying at that time. Whereas you have an hour or 2 hours a day, then you can start to expand your time that you have to include more topics. I wouldn't recommend, though, filling much more than an hour's worth of time of topics. Because even if you have 4 hours to practice a day, then there's still a point where your brain can only take in so much information. So I would say an hour's worth of information is kind of the sweet spot. Because in there, you could be learning some music theory, you could be learning some technique, you could be learning songs, right? There's a number of different topics which we want to, of course, vary. That helps so that we're not only learning one area of playing. So we're going to be working on technique or theory and, of course, like actual performance or composing in that time period for variety. Having a variety actually does help you learn faster. And some people have proposed the idea that if you just study one focused thing, that's the best route. But actually, science is starting to show that if you're actually learning a couple of tasks at the same time, that it's actually good. You find that as I'm learning photography, that it actually relates a lot to music, and it's actually strengthening my ability to think about music theory and engineering when I'm recording, right? There are a lot of parallels there. So it is actually, in some weird ways, strengthening my skills. So learning other skills outside of that can also be beneficial as long as you're following the process. So I follow this process no matter what I'm trying to learn, right? And over the years, I've learned a lot of complex music theory concepts, serial music, and a lot of atonal composition, and I use a lot of polychords. I've really gotten to a lot of deep musical composition concepts. I applied this method to that as well because those were somewhat foreign concepts for me at first, and I needed to have a method to be able to seed those deep into my brain. And now they're in there really good. You know, I teach at SUNY Purchase. I'm a professor. And I don't have to even open the books usually to know what to teach because it's embedded in my brain. It's seated really deeply because I followed these procedures. So this is a roadblock for a lot of musicians, and they feel like they're not getting better. And a lot of times it has to do with the way they're learning. I specialize in teaching intermediate guitar students. And one thing I've noticed is that when they're coming, they're stuck because they don't know how to continue the learning process and to keep leveling up their playing, and as well as teaching techniques that maybe they're a little blurry on and theory they're blurry on. I also spend time teaching about learning as well because that's the part that's going to make learning forever sustainable, essentially, right? That's renewable if you learn good ways to study. If you're digging this video, please subscribe, share, and hit the like button. It helps me out with the algorithm. And you can check out my website, anatomy of tone.com.